everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 3 of our discussion of Alice's Adventures. We're going to do I hope to get through chapter 6 of Alice in Wonderland today. I'm not sure I'll get all the way through it, though I'm confident we'll get up through into chapter 5 at least. But before we get started, quick announcement. First of all, don't forget Mythmoot is coming up. Mythmoot is the deadline for Mythmoot registration, if you want to be able to attend in person, is just over a week away on June 9th. So I think it's close of business on June 9th. So next Thursday. So if you are interested in joining us, and I hope you will, don't forget to sign up. And we are going to be doing, though, of course, a fully hybrid conference. And if you can only attend digitally, then we can do that too. And there is no restriction on that up to and through even the last day of the conference there. So, all right. So JJ was asking here, will the class ultimately cover any Alice adaptations? I have to admit, JJ, I hadn't really thought about that until this past week, but I've been getting several messages about Alice adaptations, and I think we might need to do that. We'll see. I'll think about that. We've got a while here. It's going to be a few months at least, getting through both Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. So we've got some time before we get there, but I'm thinking about it. I mean, there have been a lot of adaptations, of course, of Alice in various forms. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking about it, but I'm not sure on what principles I would choose exactly. So anyway, that's why I'm not sure. Not because I dislike the idea of looking at adaptations, but just because I'm not really quite sure. I'm neither quite sure where to start in choosing which adaptations we were to look at and discuss, and nor am I sure where to stop if we did start. So I guess Alice adaptations I have never been hugely interested. I haven't been very interested in most of them. So it's just not been a thing that I've really thought about. I love the books, but I have not generally been, I don't go out, I don't like go out of my way to see the latest Alice adaptation. So a lot of them I don't know very well. So I'm not, like, for instance, when we did Dracula, there were a bunch of adaptations that I wanted to do. But that's largely because Dracula adaptations are a fascination of mine. I'm really interested to see how modern people relate themselves to those stories. I feel like Dracula adaptations are a really interesting, like, cultural indicator in a lot of ways. So anyway, but as I say, that just happens to be like a little personal hobby of mine. So I was like very charged up to talk about Dracula adaptations, whereas again, Alice, I'm a novice when it comes to that stuff. So anyway, but we'll see. I'm definitely open to the idea of it. We'll see. We'll see what we do. We'll see what we find. But anyhow, let's one other announcement that I wanted to make sure you guys knew about, and that is an event that's happening this Saturday, our virtual open house with the Signum Academy. Our Signum Academy Clubs program has been a great program for a year. We've just celebrated our 1-year anniversary of Signum Academy Clubs, so we've had groups of young people from 3rd grade through 12th grade participating with us in language classes, creative writing clubs, language clubs, creative writing clubs, and book clubs for the last year, and would love to invite some more kids to join. This is a neat time as we're just coming into summer, so whether you're looking for some really both fun and edifying summer activities for kids, or whether you're, maybe you're a homeschooler thinking towards your fall curriculum or whatever, we have some really cool language options that you won't be able to get the same kind of language instruction anywhere else. So anyway, lots of options there. So just wanted to invite folks. That's going to be this Saturday, June 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Go to signumuniversity.org/events, and you can find our virtual open house page here. And on this page is our registration button, so you can register for the event. It's going to be a Zoom event there. So anyway, There we go. There's my announcement. Now let's dig into the text because we have more delightful poetry to get to today. So we are in chapter 3, so we're a couple of chapters behind, but that's okay. Actually, there are not very many passages that I want to talk about in relationship to chapter 3 and 4, actually. We're going to go through chapter 3 and 4 fairly quickly. And then I'm going to linger on 5 and 6. Based on the number of slides I chose, I seem to be about 4 to 5 times as eager to talk about chapters 5 and 6 as I am to talk about 3 and 4. I think shamelessly because there's more poetry in the others, but we'll see. Okay. So this is her attempting to talk to the mouse. Now you remember they had just climbed out. They swam across the pool of salt water, which was of course the pool of her own tears, right? Which you'll remember that she was abjuring herself not to shed in vain. But they finally get to the end and she's soaking wet, right? Because she's been swimming in her own tears. So she wants to get dry, right? So here's the mouse's solution. Ahem, said the mouse with an important air. Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all round, if you please. William the Conqueror, whose cause was favoured by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders, and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria... Oh, said the Lory with a shiver. I beg your pardon, said the mouse, frowning, but very politely. Did you speak? Not I, said the Lory hastily. I thought you did, said the mouse. I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable... Found what? Said the duck. Found it, the mouse replied rather crossly. Of course you know what it means. I know what it means well enough when I find a thing, said the duck. It's generally a frog, or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find? The mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans... How are you getting on now, my dear? It continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. As wet as ever, said Alice in a melancholy tone. It doesn't seem to dry me at all. In that case, said the dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies. Okay, so this is the mouse's solution for how to dry Alice off, right? Now, on the one hand, this pivots entirely, right, on a simple pun, right? That a dry text could be used to dry someone off, right? But notice it's not just a pun. It's not merely a different usage of the word, like a different meaning of the word used in the same way, right? It's a quite different sense of the word dry. I mean, it's a very different part of speech. The idea that by reading something that is dry, you, even if it were the same kind of dryness, right, that you could make someone else dry by reading it, right, is quite a separate leap. That is, it's not just about you don't only have to substitute the other meaning of the word, right, but you have to completely turn the word around, right? On one level, apart from, again, the fact that it's not that sort of dryness, right? There is also even if you take something that is the kind of dryness, the same kind of dryness, right? Looking at dry sand is not going to make you dry, right? Looking at dry sand is not going to make you dry. The fact that this thing itself has a quality called dryness is not going to bring about the quality of dryness in something else, right? There's no verb here. It's just adjective. There's no verb. So you have both levels involved in this wordplay, which of course is one reason why it's totally ineffective, right? Alice is as wet as ever. It doesn't seem to dry me at all, right? So, okay. Why? What's happening here? Now, as always, as I was saying last time, I think I was saying this last time, what I always want to be doing here is looking at the patterns, right? What patterns can we see about how, what is so commonly called nonsense? And again, it's a word that Carroll uses. I don't bash it entirely. I don't bash it. Lewis Carroll does use the word nonsense, both in the frame, in the poem, right? Remember, I believe it was Secunda who hoped that there would be nonsense in it, the story, right? And the word nonsense gets thrown around. I think it's Alice. Is it Alice who objects to people speaking such nonsense? Anyway, there's the word comes up. It's relevant to the book. But I don't trust it. I don't trust it because it's not exactly nonsense. So what I want to be looking at are patterns. What patterns do we see when we see these things? So when it comes to word usage, there are many places in this work and in Through the Looking Glass, even more delightfully, in my opinion, that we are going to see this kind of emphasis on word usage, right? So let's look at the two different examinations of English word usage in this passage. One, of course, is sort of the frame of the whole thing, right? This sense of dryness. This is the driest thing the mouse knows. So he's going to read it in hopes that it will dry Alice off. But of course, embedded within this exchange is another play on word usage patterns in English, right? And of course, I mean the duck's intervention, right? The duck, at least, seems to be paying attention to what the mouse is saying. That isn't necessarily to say that the duck is the duck's comment is entirely relevant, but he's at least listening carefully, right? When the duck says, "Found what?" What's the joke? What is Lewis Carroll putting pressure on through the question of the duck? And even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable. Found what? Said the duck. Do you see the pressure that he's putting here? The thing that Lewis is drawing our attention to? Of all the things that have been said by the mouse in his recitation of the driest thing he knows, our attention is only being drawn to this one thing. And yeah, Thistledown, it's a grammar thing, right? It's a grammar thing. He found it advisable to do something. David, exactly. The it in found it advisable is not actually a pronoun in the sense that it lacks an antecedent. This is a thing that we do in English at times, right? Use dead little pronouns, which don't really connect to anything, right? The question, found what? What did the Archbishop find? There's no answer to that question, right? He found it advisable. So our attention is being drawn to the nonsensical nature, to use the word I keep objecting to, of that particular grammatical construction. It's a kind of thing that we would say all the time without even thinking about it, right? And it's not certainly one of the things that jumps out at you about this passage of history that's being recited here, right? You could say he found advice. Sure, Mudmore, but if you said that, you'd be saying it quite differently than how this is being said. The word advice is not the antecedent of the pronoun it. He doesn't find advice advisable, right? Nor does he find the situation advisable, right? They're literal. I mean, David's right. There is literally no antecedent to the pronoun it. The word it in that sentence has no meaning. It's pointing, that pronoun, it, is pointing to something. That's the job of a pronoun, right? The job of a pronoun is it replaces a noun. It points to something. But when one uses an expression like that, and we have several of these, right? Yeah, Jackrabbit, you're right. It's like when we say, it's raining. What's raining? Yeah, exactly. That's another way in which we use a similar kind of construction, right? Now, the duck understands how pronouns work, right? And he knows how the noun found, or the verb found, works, right? That's a transitive verb, right? You can't just say, I found. You have to find something, right? Found is a transitive verb. It has to have an object or it doesn't make any sense, right? And the duck knows this, so he wants to know, what did the Archbishop find? He knows what he finds. When he finds something, it's generally a frog or a worm. But the question is, what did the Archbishop find, right? He's used a transitive, a transitive verb is being used of the Archbishop, right? And yet, nothing is in fact being found, right? And the mouse chooses not to notice this question, right? But hurriedly goes on. Yeah, Gildaloin, there are ways, like, so when people diagram sentences, there are things you can do with those pronouns. It's not that it's not actually nonsense, but it is weak writing. I just did it. It is weak writing. Well, no, that it is vaguely pointing to this kind of construction, right? So there's a vague antecedent, which is still weak writing, by the way. No, so it's called a pleonastic subject. Jackrabbit Monster, I would say that the phrase pleonastic subject is a fancy word that's been used to describe, that's a piece of descriptive grammar, right? Given that people do, in fact, talk this way, you need a way to describe that thing that they do, but that doesn't mean that that thing that they do makes sense, right? That thing that they do is still that thing that they do is still, just because we can, that people find a name to put to it doesn't mean that it's a sensible thing to do. And the duck, as I say, puts pressure there. It's not that the usage of it there is incorrect. It's not incorrect. It's a way that people genuinely talk, right? And nobody but the duck was confused at that moment, right? That's not the point. The point is not that it's not genuinely nonsensical to speak like that. But it's one of those things where when you ask the question, what did the Archbishop find? One realizes there's no answer to that question, right? It's a pointless question. It's empty. Right? That whole expression, that whole way of using language is empty. There is no answer. That's why the mouse gives no answer, right? He does not notice the question, right? He did, of course, notice it, but he chooses not to notice it. Now, why? Why do this? What's the pattern here? We've got these two word usage plays in the middle of this. Right? Our attention being forcibly drawn to this little quirk of pronoun usage that's common especially in slightly more stilted and sort of formalized or quasi-formalized English. And the peculiar, not just pun on dry, but pun plus weird reapplication of dry. Huh. Wait a second, I just noticed something. There is a pattern there. And it's all about transitive verbs. Yeah. I never noticed that before. Okay. Stick with me. Found is so remember, a transitive verb is a verb that requires an object, right? You can find as an example, right? You can't just say, I found, right? You have to find something, right? What he's trying to do is to take the adjective, what the mouse is trying to do is take the adjective dry and turn it into a transitive verb, right? He's trying to dry Alice with this dry passage of text, right? The text is dry, and he's trying to use it to dry her. He's trying to take this state of dryness and make it transitive, right? And in the midst of his passage, which he is trying to apply in a transitive fashion to Alice, the duck draws our attention to transitive verbs by pointing out that this transitive verb fails of its object at all, that the Archbishop does not, in fact, find a singular thing, not a frog, not a worm, right? Therefore, nothing of use, of any manner of use, does the Archbishop find. And of course, nor does the mouse succeed in drying Alice. We've got failures of transitive verbs all over the place, right? Yeah. That's, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. So the duck is, in a sense, not deliberately. I don't think the duck is like cannily mocking the enterprise of the mouse here, right? I don't think the duck is quite that aware, but I do think it draws our attention in those directions. Yes, David, it's pointing out and making fun of things we take for granted. Yes, and it does that in two ways, right? We take for granted what the it refers to. Again, we generally understand that construction, even though there's no antecedent to that word, right? We generally don't ask the question, what did the Archbishop find? But at the same time, the fact that the mouse is attempting to make transitive the concept of dryness, right? To transfer dryness from the text to Alice herself, it draws our attention to the sort of the futility of that. We take for granted these kinds of usages, right? Well, of course, by reading something that is dry isn't going to make anybody else dry. But yes, David, I think that a very great deal of significant percentage of the humor in Lewis Carroll hinges directly on this. That would be my vote for one of the dominant patterns in all of Lewis Carroll is pointing out the things that we take for granted, right? Drawing our attention to things that we might say or pass by without noticing, or alternatively, like sometimes belaboring things that we, like bringing our attention to things which like don't seem to make sense to us because we don't think of that is like, again, playing on this whole idea of the stuff that you take for granted. And he does that in multiple different directions. Jackrabbit Monster, it's interesting. I do think that it's a meditation on the contrast between concrete and abstract. I think that that's interesting. The dryness, again, it's not just that it's an adjectival instead of a verbal dryness. It's a totally different sort of dryness, right? If you submerged this book in water, it would not make that text any less dry, right? Yeah, I agree. It's a metaphorical, abstract dryness, right? So again, that play between the metaphorical and the literal, I think perhaps better than concrete and abstract. Maybe that's a little bit more precise. Maybe we'll see. Well, that is, we'll see if we see that pattern in other places. But yeah, the thing between the metaphorical and the literal. I'm always a little bit hesitant to use the word literal because a lot of people struggle with applying the word literal in my experience. But for lack of anything else, yes, the metaphorical and the literal. Yeah, that's interesting, Jackrabbit. The it of the mouse is abstract and the it of the duck is concrete. That is interesting. Yeah, maybe you're right about abstract and concrete. I don't know. But anyway, there's another element of this whole situation, right? And that's as who was talking about that? David was talking about this. Recitation. Alice tries repeatedly to recite her lessons. Yes. And what is the mouse reciting? Her lessons, right? I mean, that's the other joke, right? So you've got the word play, you've got the grammar joke that underlies this, that kind of 2-level grammar joke with the transitive verbs and all that kind of thing. And then, but you also have the childhood nursery lessons joke, right? It's not just any random dry text that he's reciting. He's not reciting the dictionary. He's not reciting, some piece of, I don't know, legal analysis or something like that. He's reciting a history lesson, and exactly the sort of history lesson that Alice has probably had to hear at school, right? In her lessons. This is undoubtedly from her own lessons that the mouse is reciting, right? So you see, of course, the other joke here. The recitation of the history lesson about William the Conqueror does Alice no good at all, right? Now, of course, the good that the mouse is trying to do is to dry her off, which is ridiculous. But again, you see the joke there, right? Why is this kind of lesson useless for little girls of 7 years old? Well, because it's very dry, right? It's very dry history. And so the mouse tries to recite it in order to dry her off, hoping that it might do some good in that way. It's because of the badness of the prose, right? Because of how boring this passage is that the mouse thinks it might be of use, ironically, right? But of course, turns out it's not even good for that, right? So there you go. Edith, that's a pretty deep lesson for a modern second grader. I'm sorry to say it's not a very deep lesson for a mid-19th century second grader who would certainly have been many years ahead of a modern second grader in American public schools. That's pretty clear when you look at old lesson books from the 19th century and see what they were advising teaching children at what age. However, Edith, it is boring, right? I mean, again, this is not like Alice's favorite lesson. This seems to be one of Alice's least favorite lessons that's being recited at her. So maybe it doesn't do her any good because she finds it very boring. But anyway. But yes, I don't think in the mid-19th century they would have considered this. Like inappropriate for a child of 7 to be learning. A child of 7 should, know about William the Conqueror. And I should say an English child of 7 should know about William the Conqueror. Okay. Keep in mind, as a joke about Alice's lessons, it also fits part of the broader pattern, right? Her lessons have are now a bona fide motif of this book. She was reciting the things. Remember how proud she is of the things that she knows, right? Alice is a good student. Alice is a good student and knows a prodigious number of things. That's how you can tell her apart from Mabel, for instance, remember? So Alice knows all these things. Now, she's been having a problem reciting the things that she knows since she's gone down the rabbit hole, right? So that's an issue. Here we have one of her lessons recited back to her, and it's useless. There's a complete disconnection between her and her lessons. So that appears to be continuing. The disconnection between Alice and what she has learned, right, between Alice and her lessons, seems to be continuous, even though this goes, in a sort of a different sort of way. Yeah, Jed Artanis, you're right. Tolkien was reading, writing, and reciting Greek at that age. No, they would have. 19th century schoolboys would have been learning Latin for years by the time they were 7, for sure, and some of them Greek. Yes. Anyway, okay. All right. Let's keep going. All right. So, the Mouse Tale poem. You knew I had to talk about the Mouse's Tail poem. So here's the transition into it. You promised to tell me your history, you know, said Alice, and why it is you hate C and D, she added in a whisper, half afraid that it would be offended again. Cats and dogs, you remember about it said it would tell her why he hates cats and dogs. Alice, notice, has the tact this time not to allude to them explicitly, right? She's showing very great sensitivity here, isn't she? Mine is a long and a sad tale, said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. It is a long tale, certainly, said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail. But why do you call it sad? And she kept on puzzling about it while the mouse was speaking, so that her idea of the tale was something like, and we'll get to her idea of the tale of the mouse in just a second. Okay. So, another pun, right? Another play on words here. The mouse is going to tell her a long and sad tale, and Alice is distracted. It is a long tale, certainly, right? Looking at the mouse's. So she's staring at the mouse's tail and failing to listen to the mouse's story, right? So we can see from the beginning that she's not tracking at all, right? Why do you call it sad? What's sad about your tail? It looks like a perfectly respectable tail, right? And David, I certainly agree that Alice has misunderstood the mouse's discomfort from the beginning. Even her apparent tact, right, with C and D isn't the words cat and dog, but as David says, her fond references to her pets. And not only that, but she, both times, when she talked about cats and when she talked about dogs, she talked about them catching mice, right? I mean, she overtly alludes, she forgets herself and her audience so completely. Well, I guess it's not herself she's forgetting, it's really her audience. Notice that's an interesting expression. That's exactly the kind of expression that Lewis Carroll would make fun of, by the way, to forget oneself. But anyway, Alice does not forget herself, but she forgets her audience, right? And actually segues to talking about the cats and dogs killing mice or rats, which is why, of course, the mouse is appropriately offended. And now she is once again still. So her problem with the mouse is that she's been too self-absorbed, right? She just absolutely cannot get outside her own head into thinking about things from the mouse's perspective. And now she's looking at the mouse, but even her gaze at the mouse is superficial, or rather, she's using her eyes instead of her ears. She's supposed to be using her ears to listen to the tale, the story of the mouse, and instead she's using her eyes to look at the physical tale of the mouse, and she keeps on puzzling about it, puzzling about why the mouse considers the tale both long and sad, right, while the mouse is speaking. And so her visual contemplation of the mouse's tail, combined with apparently her only rather distant and background hearing of the mouse's tale, leads her to hear what he says as if it looked like this. And again, for those who are only listening and cannot see my slides, this is, of course, one of the visual images in the book. We have the text of the mouse's story, which in a very narrow column, there's never more than 4 small words, usually 2 words or 2 parts of words, in a line. And it's winding down the page like the winding tale of the mouse, right? So what's the mouse's long, sad tale? Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do." Said the mouse to the cur, "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge would be wasting our breath." "I'll be judge, I'll be jury," said cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death." Also, the text gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you go through, until when you get to the tip of the tail, it's very, very difficult to read. Fortunately, my slide is fairly heavily magnified and I'm wearing my reading glasses, so I can still make out what it says. Now, one thing which interests me greatly, which will surprise none of you, is that the mouse's tale is poetic, right? He is speaking in verse. It's clearly verse, right? You can hear that it's in verse. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have a trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do." You can hear the shape of that, right? You've got the 2 short lines, or like a 1 line with internal rhyme. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house. And then we've got a longer line with no internal rhyme. "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." So let's see. Are those lines of equal length? Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house. "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." Yeah, same length. "Come, I'll take no denial. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do." Yeah, roughly. It's a little irregular, the meter, but it's consistent. It's a little unusual is what I guess I mean. But it's consistent. Now I don't know exactly, why I, and you, so Sarah and Mighty Felix, I don't really know, why those are in italics, because they are. "I will prosecute you," which sounds like it's a reversal, right? Instead of you prosecuting me, I will prosecute you. Fury, I don't know who Fury is. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." Okay. It sounds like there was more to this story that we're not getting, right? Who's Fury? I mean, I assume it's not like a fury, like one of the Greek furies. And I assume it's not, I mean, if it's a person named Fury, is it a human? What sort of person is it named Fury? I don't know. Fury said to a mouse that he met, that is, I certainly don't know when it starts, right? Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do." So it's out of boredom that he is taking the mouse to court, right? To prosecute him. Okay, said the mouse to the cur. Okay, right, so Fury is apparently a dog, which we don't learn until just after the second bend in the tale, right? Said the mouse to the cur, "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath." "I'll be judge, I'll be jury," said cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death." Now, this does manage this does manage to, it's relevant, right? The mouse is meant to be explaining why he objects to cats and dogs, right? And he does seem to be telling a poetical story about a dog who is attempting to entrap a mouse in some way, right? Okay. So it's relevant. Yeah, the house, it seems to be, as you say, Cecilia, kind of pre-established as part of this story. I mean, we're clearly starting in the middle of the story. I can only imagine that means there must have been an earlier part of the story which Alice just totally missed, right? So this is only a portion of the mouse's long, sad tale, because of course, this is not. If you were to put it in regular lines, it's not so very long a tale after all, right? Though when you stretch it out like this, it makes for quite a long tail with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bends in it, right? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So what's the joke here? Well, again, first we start with a pun, tail and tail, right? And then we do a poem, and we do a shape poem out of it, right? Now, if you're a 19th century school child, right? Does anybody know famous shape poems? Anybody know in English tradition, the most famous shape poet in English tradition? This was kind of a thing. It was kind of a thing. Anybody ever do any shape poetry? What do they teach them at these schools these days? The great English shape poem, Aslan's Compass has got it. George Herbert. George Herbert is the great. Yes, you're right. Shel Silverstein, unfortunately, David, is the wrong generation. He also played with the shape poem thing, though he, like Lewis Carroll, was generally being satirical about the shape poem thing. So George Herbert was a Christian devotional poet primarily, and his two most famous, the two that you usually see in anthologies by George Herbert are one called Easter Wings and one called The Altar. Those are his two most famous shape poems, and again, most commonly anthologized, or at least they used to be. No, wrong Herbert, not the guy who wrote Dune, Jared. Yeah, very, very different Herbert. You've got Frank, but then you have George, who's significantly older. Now, George Herbert is Isaac Watts was the writer of hymns we talked about last week, who's also old, from a similar time period, actually, to George Herbert. George Herbert was like 17th century, basically 1600s, like Watt. And the poetry of that era, George Herbert is not too far removed chronologically from John Donne, right? And metaphysical poets were all about the shape of their poetry. Metaphorically, the shape, like not literally the shape. So like the structure of the poem and where, like, I mean, in John Donne, you can always you find like the center of the poem and things will kind of pivot around that, and he'll usually kind of play on that, and it's all extremely clever. Anyway, so George Herbert kind of takes that concept and takes it kind of to a different level, right? I'm not saying it's better, because George Herbert has way fewer fans than John Donne, and there are good reasons for that. I like George Herbert myself, but his poem, I like Easter Wings much better than I like The Altar. But again, the play there is that on the one hand, it might look like a simple kind of trick. Like the poem Easter Wings, which is an Easter poem, of course, is in the shape, like the words form on the page, the words are printed so as to form the shape of a pair of wings, right? But the point is not just like, hey, I can write something and I can make the printer print it so that it makes a picture of the thing that I'm talking about. That's a simple trick. That's a cheap trick, right? But the better trick is if you can make the poetic structure of the poem actually interact with that shape that it's actually forming, right? And that's really cool, right? That's actually really fun. And George Herbert does some pretty fun things with his shape poetry. Anyway, so this was kind of a thing. It wasn't a huge thing. It wasn't a dominant thing, literarily speaking, but it's definitely a thing, right? And so in the end, he takes the pun, tale and tale, and he makes a poetic play on it. He makes a shape poem, which is a tale, which is a story that's shaped like a tale, right? And it's forced into that shape by Alice, who is staring at the mouse's physical tail so her eyes are following his tail while her ears are much less avidly following her it's his story, anyway, so he combines these two things, right? And they are combined as a shape poem is combined, right? And he shapes this fairly carefully. Notice how we have at the top of the tail, where the base of the tail is wider, more words. Fury said to, first line. A mouse, that, second line. He met in the third line. House, let, fourth line. Us both go, fifth line, right? So fairly long lines. But then by the time we get down to the middle of the tail, we have strictly 2 syllables per line, right? This morning I've nothing to do, said the mouse to the cur, such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge. And then it starts, would is our first monosyllabic line, right? Until it's down to almost monosyllables all the way down to the last word. And where does the poem end? What is the tip of the mouse's tail? Is the word death, right? And that's where the story ends. That's where the tale ends. The tale ends with the death of the mouse. So does this story seem incomplete? Oh no, the story is quite complete, right? If you read it as a shape poem, it is complete, right? Because what is the end of the mouse's tail? The death of the mouse, right? Death is the end of the mouse's tail, of its tail, the tail. Anyway, you see, right? And yeah, exactly, Jackrabbit Monster. That's why it's a sad tale, because it ends in death, right? There you go. There you go. So it becomes this fun sort of literary play, right? Now, let me think for a second about the shape here. Because it's, as I say, it's a peculiar poetic shape. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, let us both go to law, I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial, we must have a trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do. Said the mouse to the cur, such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge would be wasting our breath. I'll be judge, I'll be jury, said cunning old Fury, I'll try the whole cause, and I'll condemn you to death. Okay. It is pretty regular anapaests. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house. So, or basically anapaestic tetrameter. One of Dr. Seuss's favorite meters, right? I saw somebody making a Dr. Seuss comment earlier on. Don't tempt me to spend a long time talking about Dr. Seuss because, man, that guy could write poetry. We could do a great discussion of Dr. Seuss's poetics. Oh my goodness. But anyway, okay. Yes, anapestic tetrameter. Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." Let us both go to law. Ah, hang on a second. I just figured out the italics. I figured out the italics and I will prosecute you. It's not a reversal. I is italicized in order to make sure we stress that word, right? Because it's an unstressed syllable in the anapestic pattern. Anapest, just in case you're not familiar with the vocabulary, right? Anapest means unstressed, stressed, right? As I say, Dr. Seuss loved this meter. Sneetches is in anapestic tetrameter. The Grinch is in anapestic tetrameter. Then the Grinch did the same to the other whose houses, leaving crumbs much too small for the other whose mouses. One of my favorite lines. Leaving crumbs much too small. Bum 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 bum. So the star-bellied Sneetches had bellies with stars, but the plain-bellied Sneetches had none upon theirs. Bum 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 bum. That's anapestic tetrameter. 4 anapestic feet, unstressed, stressed, per line, right? Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." Hear how that falls, right? I is the first syllable of the unstressed phrase. I will prosecute. Pros is where the rhythm of the line leads you to lay the stress, right? But of course, there's a tension there between the emphasis of the prose, right? The emphasis of the speech and the poetic line. And so in order to make sure you don't get so into the rhythm that you skim over it, this was written back in a day when people were more experienced doing that sort of thing and were more likely to get caught up in the rhythm of a poem. He italicizes I and you, right? You is stressed. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have a trial. For really this morning I've nothing to do. Said the mouse to the cur, "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge would be wasting our breath." You listen to, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas is an anapestic tetrameter as well. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Notice one of the things that he does with the anapestic lines. Anapestic feet. So iambic feet, which we talk about more in Exploring the Lord of the Rings, because most of Tolkien's poetry is in iambic meters. Most of all English poetry is in iambic meter, but anapest is more unusual and harder to maintain, which is one of the reasons one of the ways you can know that Dr. Seuss was a complete poetic genius. But one of the effects of it is that the stressed syllables jump out at you much more. Couldn't you hear it when I was reading it? Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you." Fury. So said, mouse, met, house, both, law, prosecute you. Take, denial, must, trial, really, morning, nothing, do. Noth, do. Right? Mouse, cur, trial, sir, jury, judge, waste, breath, judge, jury, cunning, fury, try, cause, dem, death, right? Those are the stressed syllables in this poem. And you can get almost the whole story from the stressed syllables, right? They really do, jump, and like all of the ominousness, right? All of there's a lot of weight on those stressed syllables, emphasized by the internal rhyme that we get in the first line of each of those, right? Yep. Yeah. Um, okay. So, this is one of the things that interests me about the fact that he's latched into poetry for the tale, is that the contrast between the mouse's story, which Alice fails to attend to. She's not paying any attention to what the mouse is actually saying, right? She doesn't. She's like so ignoring him. She doesn't even parse like what he means by saying it's a long, sad tale. That's a really almost cliched thing for him to say, right? And she's not tracking because she's not listening to him at all, right? In fact, she's treating his recitation of his poetic story, which is actually kind of eventful, right? Confusing, weird, because we've got a dog and a mouse, in like a legal debate, right? But yeah, Jack Rabbit Monster says at least it isn't dry. That's the thing. She treats it like it were the mouse's recitation of the William the Conqueror boring paragraph, right? So we have these two things next to each other. The recitation of the William the Conqueror paragraphs by the mouse, right? The driest thing he knows. And the much jazzier and more interesting to listen to, not to mention look at on the page, right? Based on the shape poem that we get. And yet Alice's response is she's exactly as detached from the one as from the other. The one failed to dry her off. The second failed to engage not even her emotions, but even her attention, right? So look at what happens after. "You were not attending," said the mouse to Alice severely. "What are you thinking of?" "I beg your pardon," said Alice very humbly. "You had got to the fifth bend, I think." "I had not," cried the mouse, sharply and very angrily. "A knot," said Alice, always ready to make herself useful, and looking anxiously about her. "Oh, do let me help to undo it." "I shall do nothing of the sort," said the mouse, getting up and walking away. "You insult me by talking such nonsense." "I didn't mean it," pleaded poor Alice, "but you're so easily offended, you know." The mouse only growled in reply. Okay. Yes, Jack Rabbit Monster says another pun that turns on abstract and concrete. I had not, and I had a knot, right? Yes, exactly. Also notice, Jack Rabbit, the back end of that pun as well. "Oh, do let me help to undo it," right? "Oh, do let me help to undo it." Notice that statement is in anapaests, right? "Oh, do let me help to a knot." "A knot," said Alice. "Oh, do let me help to undo it." Yeah, Mad Violinist, you're right. There are anapaests all over this. Yeah, exactly. "Do let me help to undo it." So the repetition of "do," right? She wants to undo the knot. But of course, she also, the irony is there is something that she should want to undo, and that is her lack of attention, right? She has in fact insulted the mouse again, right? Through her inattention and her disregard for the mouse and what it's saying and what it's feeling, right? There is something that she should want to help to undo, and that is the offense that she's given to the mouse. But of course, it's the knot that she is mistaking, because she's just, unlike the duck, who seems to be sort of stepping in kind of comical misunderstanding. Alice is misunderstanding too, but she's just mishearing, right? She doesn't have a grammatical confusion, right, based on what the mouse said. She's just not listening. And mistakes NOT for KNOT, right? And again, there's the irony. She's always ready to make herself useful, right? That Alice, always thoughtful, right? Always looking to help others. Always, looking out for people who might need a little assistance. Except when she's completely ignoring them, right? And yes, Sarah, what's a wonderful point. We see the play on the word do there. Do let me, do let me, do give me permission, right? And to undo something. So do used as a helping verb, right? And then do used as the main verb, undo, right? Used as the main verb there. Those juxtaposed against each other, have that comical sort of sense there. And I agree. I think that's fun. Yeah. The mouse then responds in the end. David, this is a great question. Alice thinks of herself as quite a good student. Is this an indication that she's not so clever as she thinks? That's a question that's almost impossible to answer from within this story, right? We saw a hint when she was trying to recite her multiplication tables that the answer was in there. She really did know what 4 times 5 was. She just there seemed to be some disjunction between her and her words, right? Here we see that there's a disjunction between her and the mouse's words, right? I believe that she actually knows the Isaac Watts poem by heart. How doth the little, right? I'm sure she successfully memorized How doth the little busy bee and could have recited it to her tutor. But it came out wrong when she recited it, right? And again, I doubt that she accidentally recited How doth the little crocodile when she was in her lessons, right? Back in the normal world. But here it doesn't come out right. Again, that Alice is herself puzzled by her own words. Again, that disjunction between her and her words is important. Is clearly an important element here. But now when there's a disjunction, so David, just coming back to your point, that's why I find it impossible to tell. She's either very clever or much less clever than she thinks, right? I'm perfectly willing to believe she's probably less clever than she thinks herself, right? But I don't think it's safe to conclude that all of this is just a joke, that Alice is the butt of the joke here, right? That Alice is quite dumb. Alice is actually a stupid little girl, and the text is making fun of her for that. I don't think that doesn't feel to me right. It doesn't seem right. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. I know, JJ, she's not Mabel, for crying out loud. That's exactly it. But as I say, you could prove either side, right, of that argument if you tried hard enough. All right. I think this is my only passage from chapter 4. And Dan, I agree. On the one hand, all of these like individual like jokes and these kind of like these nesting puns and this play in these different plays on things are all nested within this dream framework, which is, I agree with you, a brilliant evocation of how everything gets away from you in dreams. That's very much how this, that's like, another level of all of this, right? Which makes this a lot of fun. But anyway, okay. Chapter 4. So she's, this is after she's gone into the house of the White Rabbit, right? Who is bossing her around. And when she got in there, she drinks something else again, doesn't she? And then grows very large. I'm pretty sure it was drinking this time that made her grow large. And she's swollen up to it barely fits in the room now, right? And this is her comment on that. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't always growing larger and smaller, being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole. And yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought. And when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now, she added in a sorrowful tone. At least there's no room to grow up any more here. Because, of course, she is at the maximum capacity of that room. But then, thought Alice, shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort one way, never to be an old woman. But then, always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that. Oh, you foolish Alice, she answered herself. How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for any lesson books. And so she went on, taking first one side and then the other, and making quite a conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes, she heard a voice outside and stopped to listen. Jack Rabbit, yes, we've got Alice being two people again, right? Yes. Alice being two people again. As we see now, there's plenty of her to go around, right? Because she's very large again now. You'll notice also this trend of the play on things that we normally take for granted, right? Like the phrase, I'm all grown up, right? Which means two things at once, right? Or at least elides two things at the same time. On the one hand, it does refer to physical growth, right? You are all grown up when you have become a full-sized person, right? As an adult, from being a more diminutive child. But yet, of course, the concept of growing up is not just about alteration in physical size, right? Though that expression is used alluding to both things, they're not growing older, growing more mature is not in fact the same thing as merely gaining in size, which of course is what has been played on already several times, right? Like she was much too big a girl to be crying, right? And that was certainly true. And she herself makes the joke, right? When I grow up, I'll write one, but I'm grown up now, right? Then she turns, drawing herself attention to that phrase grown up, right? Shall I never get any older than I am now? Have I finished growing up because I'm as big as I can possibly get now, right? So shall I never get any older if I can? Are in fact growing up and growing up the same thing, right? Since we use that phrase to refer both to growing older and to gaining size, if I've gained sufficient size, does that mean I shall never grow older? And that's comfort in one way, never to be an old woman, right? So perpetual youth doesn't sound so bad. But then if she remains the age she is, then she'll have to be in school forever because she's in school now. And if she never gets any older, then she'll have to be in school forever and always have lessons to learn. And she shouldn't like that. As we've once again see the motif of Alice's lessons creeping in here, and indeed her, well, I won't go so far as to say aversion. That's a strong word, but her complicated relationship, right? Her ambivalent relationship with her lessons, perhaps. Right. Jocelyn says, silly Alice, I would love to be in school forever. Right. To which Mighty Felix responds, yes, but maybe not second grade. Right. Exactly. I was gonna say, spoken like somebody who didn't have to go to school forever. Right. That is, it's much easier to long for that and appreciate that when you don't have to do it, especially to be staying in second grade. Yes. She calls herself foolish and then counter-argues against herself. Obviously, she can't always have lessons to learn, right? She won't be learning lessons for the rest of her life. Now that she's grown up, she certainly won't be learning lessons anymore because she's so grown up that she barely even fits in this room, and there's no room at all for any lesson books because she excludes the lesson books from the room because she is so large and has filled the room to capacity. And here again, you see the other kind of layer of the joke that's being added to that, right? Why do we teach children lessons, right? Why do we make them learn lessons? To expand their minds, right? Well, Alice is fully expanded at this point. There's not even room for the books in the room, right? Her horizons are about as broad as they can possibly be right now, or at least she is as broad as she can possibly be. She's making quite a conversation of it altogether, right? In the end. Anyway, let me go backwards. I skipped a whole bunch of stuff in that first paragraph. She almost wishes that she hadn't gone down the rabbit hole. The two things she complains of. It was much pleasanter at home, right? And of course, pleasanter is not a word any more than curiouser is a word. She's being rather indulgent with her comparatives here, right? But anyway, what does she complain of? She complains of A, always growing larger and smaller, and B, being ordered about by mice and rabbits, right? These are her chief complaints of her trip down the rabbit hole. She doesn't know what she is, her sense of identity, as we were looking at before, her losing touch with her body parts, her not being in control of who she is. She literally doesn't know if she's Alice or if she's Mabel, right? And of what that means about how she fits into the world around her, right? Normally, she would not be ordered about by mice and rabbits, right? I mean, that's a particularly funny phrase, isn't it? Of all the animals in the animal kingdom that one might end up conversing with, one might least expect to be ordered about by mice and rabbits, perhaps. She almost wishes that she hadn't gone down the rabbit hole. But actually, there's something to be said for it, right? I wonder what can have happened to me. Very different from, notice how this is a shift for her. Before, since everything was strange around her, she was convinced that she must be different, right? She must have woken up as someone else for whom the world works very differently, apparently, right? But now, by saying, I wonder what can have happened to me, implying that she's the one who has remained the same and something has happened. Well, I guess not. Something happened to me still makes her the center of things, doesn't it? It's not quite yet her considering herself as being the that the world changed around her. It's not, in fact, quite different. And then she connects it to fairy tales. She used to disbelieve fairy tales. And now here I am in the middle of one. I fancied that kind of thing never happened. And now here I am in the middle of one. So here she has proven. And yes, I agree. General Woundwort doesn't count when it comes to the strangeness of being ordered around by rabbits. General Woundwort is what we would call a bad data point when it comes to rabbits giving orders, I think. Anyway, okay. But the fairy tales. This makes her reconsider the general question. Are fairy tales fiction? She had always fancied that they were. Fancied, by the way. It was an act of fancy, a piece of fantasy, an imagination on her part, right? In her imagination, she had fancied that fairy tales didn't happen, right? She had this sort of notion that fairy tales were fictional, even fantastical. And now here I am in the middle of one. Okay. So there she's proven. apparently she's not too grown up for fairy tales. In fact, there's another joke, another piece of irony, right? When you grow up, you'll be too big for fairy tales. Well, Alice growing up and getting big is what made her think she's in a fairy tale. That's what made her believe in fairy tales, right? Growing up and getting big. And I definitely think that that's a joke, right? On fairy tales and on grown-ups not reading fairy tales. There ought to be a book written about me. That there ought. That's a good idea. There ought to be a book written about Alice. Her adventures, to chronicle, her rather extraordinary and curious adventures, right? But of course, if other people read it, they might think it a fairy tale or even perhaps nonsense. Now, Jenna Artanis, I'm not completely sure what gave her the idea that she's in a fairy tale specifically. The only thing she talks about is growing larger and smaller and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I had the vague idea when she says, I fancied that kind of thing never happened. What kind of thing? Exactly. Going down rabbit holes? Talking with animals? That's definitely a fairy tale thing, talking to animals. Maybe that's the kind of thing that she's referring to that happened in fairy tales. Being the victim of magical spells, such as it might be making one larger and smaller, would be also a fairy tale thing, I think. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to chapter 5. We got to get to my favorite poem in the book. Here's the caterpillar. Love this. Who are you? Said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then. What do you mean by that? Said the caterpillar sternly. Explain yourself. I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, said Alice, because I'm not myself, you see. I don't see, said the caterpillar. I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, Alice replied very politely, for I can't understand it myself to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing. It isn't, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet, said Alice, but when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will some day, you know, and then after that into a butterfly. I think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps your feelings may be different, said Alice. All I know is it would feel very queer to me. You, said the caterpillar contemptuously. Who are you? Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Now, I am sure that many of you, the can't see a apostrophe N apostrophe T, that's old-fashioned contraction. If you think about it, it makes sense. A CAN apostrophe T does not make sense. ISN apostrophe T makes sense. Is not. There's one letter that you're skipping, the O, in not. And so you put an apostrophe to mark where a letter is skipped, right? But can not explain myself. You've skipped both the N and the O, one of the N's and the O, and so you have to have an apostrophe for both, clearly, right? We skip the later one because we're sloppy and we don't care, right? But that's not how one used to do contractions. Anyway, okay. What was I talking about? Okay. So many things to talk about here. I could probably spend a whole class on this passage alone. But let's I can't. I just can't. Much more. All right. All right. The caterpillar begins with a load. Oh, I remember what I was about to say before. If you find yourself frequently and inescapably remembering Bilbo and Gandalf's conversation at the beginning of chapter 1 of The Hobbit about good morning and how many things Bilbo does use the word good morning for, right? With Gandalf saying, is it a morning to be good on, right? Or whatever. If that sounds familiar to you, if that sounds, if what's being said here begins to make you think of Bilbo and Gandalf, it really should. Right? That is a very Lewis Carroll moment. High Lewis Carroll influence, in my opinion, in the beginning of chapter 1. And you can tell when Tolkien is setting out to write an amusing story for children, one of the modes that he begins in is a very Lewis Carroll mode, right? And that play on good morning is very Lewis Carroll. Okay, anyway. Caterpillar begins. Who are you? This, as I say, for Alice is a particularly weighted, if not indeed an insensitive question. Oh, good. Yes, Sarah, you had just said that. I actually didn't even see your comment. But yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it looks like I was responding to you, but I could pretend I was responding to you. But no, I actually literally didn't see your comment there. That's exactly right. Sarah was just making that observation about the good morning. Anyhow, he begins with a very loaded question, indeed an almost insensitive question under the circumstances, because Alice is feeling quite upset about not knowing who she is, right? And he asks the question, who are you? But it seems that his stress is a little bit peculiar. We get the you italicized, right? Who are you? And it depends on your tone of voice, doesn't it? That could mean several things. It certainly doesn't just mean, who are you? Or who are you? You are a stranger. Who are you? The stress isn't on are, right? The stress is on you. Who are you? Meaning she is somebody whom he wasn't expecting. He was expecting somebody else, and instead this girl showed up, and so he says, who are you? That's one possible way to inflect that, right? But there's another way to inflect it, right? Who are you? Like, who do you think you are? Which, of course, would be an even more pointed and pointedly awkward question to ask Alice, right? Who do you think you are? Oh, I'm quite afraid I might be Mabel, right? Would be the answer here. And truly, Alice finds it not a very encouraging opening for a conversation. Which is, again, might seem like a strange thing, because who are you is actually not really weird opening gambit for a conversation. I mean, it's a little bit off-putting maybe, depending on your tone of voice, but, seems like fairly normal. But for Alice, this is not encouraging. And especially if it's inflected more harshly as I expect it to be. Who are you? Who do you think you are? Who are you making yourself out to be? A challenge to her identity, right? A question which implies you are not who you really seem to be making out that you are, right? Which, of course, again, really hits Alice home, right? Yes, Jackrabbit Monster, as in, why do you matter to me? Exactly, right? Why should I care who you are? Yes, exactly. I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then, right? Okay, so poor Alice has really lost touch with her identity. It was bad enough when she thought she might be Mabel, but now she just doesn't know. Maybe she's been multiple people. What do you mean by that? Explain yourself, the caterpillar says sternly. And again, wow, awkward commands to give to Alice. Explain yourself. I can't explain myself, sir. No, she's been trying to explain herself to herself for the whole book. And herself, although herself has been the primary focus of her attention, herself has also been the thing that she cannot explain. So there's the neutral sense of his words. Explain yourself, right? Which just means tell me what you mean by that, right? But of course, in the context, to Alice's ear, and perhaps to ours too, being used to Alice's dilemmas here, it has quite a different sense. What should she explain? It's herself that she should explain, right? She responds to it with yet a third emphasis. I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself, you see, right? Introducing a novel usage of the phrase, I'm not myself, right? You might not be feeling yourself, but you probably don't mean that you're questioning your fundamental identity, right? Or fearing that you may have somehow been either externally or internally transmogrified into a different person, right? Even though that, of course, would seem to be what we imply by saying I'm not feeling myself. I can't explain myself because I am not myself. She doesn't know who she is, and so of course she can't explain herself. I am not myself, you see. I don't see, said the caterpillar. Once again, Alice tosses off an expression that she doesn't even think about. You see. I'm not myself, you see. The caterpillar does not see, right? She has asserted, she's made a claim about him, that he sees that she is not herself. But of course, he can see nothing of the kind, right? I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, Alice replied, not understanding his objection, apparently. For I can't understand it myself, to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing. It isn't, said the caterpillar. Well, not apparently to him, right? What's the caterpillar doing? The caterpillar noticed that there is once again a disjunction between what one person is saying and what the other person is saying. Alice is now the victim, in a sense, of a very similar thing to what she was doing to the mouse, right? She was not really attending to what the mouse said. She certainly wasn't trying to follow his tail, T-A-L-E, right? Trying to follow his story. Instead, she was looking at his tail, T-A-I-L, right? And thinking about that. And the caterpillar is doing a similar thing. He's not playing along with her. He refuses to enter into her point of view and her expressions, right? I'm not myself, you see. I don't see. Being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing. It isn't. It isn't to him. He understands perfectly well why she's been many different sizes in a day, right? Because he understands how this world that is strange to her works. But of course, she's speaking about her own confusion, and he responds as if she had just made a claim about his confusion. But of course, notice that that's an inversion of what she just did. She just made a claim about him. You see, right? She claimed that he sees that she's not herself. And he's like, I don't see, in fact, right? And then she said that she was confused, made a statement about her own self. And he takes that as if it means a statement about him. It is not confusing. Again, at least not to her. Oh, Jackrabbit Monster, I would not be a bit surprised if Lewis Carroll was not aware of the fact. I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in my syntax there. Jackrabbit Monster says, Lewis Carroll, probably didn't know this, but caterpillars have very bad eyesight, being only able to sense light and dark, not shapes or colors. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Lewis Carroll knew that. So that when the caterpillar says, I don't see, there's a whole other level of meaning as well. Like, I don't really have functioning eyes, right? Is of course another meaning of I don't see. Perhaps you haven't found it so yet, said Alice, and then waxes into a slightly superior kind of tone. When you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, you know. and then after that into a butterfly. I should think you'll feel it a little queer, won't you? What's she doing? She's showing off her information again. She learned in her lessons that caterpillars turn into chrysalis. A caterpillar turns into a chrysalis, and then after that into a butterfly, right? And so she's once again trotting out her knowledge in this, with this slightly condescending tone, slightly show-offy tone, right? You will someday, you know, right? I should think you'll feel a little queer, won't you? You'll feel it a little queer? It'll feel strange to you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. She's not just asserting facts about caterpillar biology. She is making an assertion ultimately about how he is likely to feel about this future change of events. She's trying to turn the tables on him, right? He doesn't think it's confusing to be many differently, I bet, right? When you change, then the shoe will be on the other foot, so to speak, right? And I bet you'll feel it strange there. Not a bit, said the caterpillar. And of course, the caterpillar, one can see, is quite right, right? It's not a bit queer for a caterpillar to turn into a chrysalis and then a butterfly. That's the normal life of a caterpillar, right? Whereas being so many different sizes in a day, like Alice has done, is exactly not her normal life at all, right? So yeah, once again, David, we see this lack of empathy. She's trying to empathize, but she's not really empathizing. She's asserting his feelings, right? But there is that she's, in a sense, she's trying to put herself inside his head, right? But she does it kind of in the wrong way. She does it assertively in that way. Yeah, exactly. His change is natural. Hers isn't, Thistledown. That's exactly right. Well, perhaps your feelings may be different. All I know is it would feel very queer to me, says Alice, going back to safe terrain, which is asserting her own feelings, and how she would feel if she were a caterpillar, which would not be normal for her. To which the caterpillar returns with contempt. You? Who are you? And we can hear it much more clearly that second time. Who are you? Why should I care how you feel? Right? Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. So this pattern of the disjunction between the speaker and the hearer, the taking words in other senses, the sort of calling her on her every turn of speech, is definitely a recurring trend. Okay, but let's get to the poem. So, the poem. This is another parody poem. Here's the original poem by Robert Southey, one of the Lake poets, right? Robert Southey, friend of Byron and, Wordsworth, who's one of the Romantics. Robert Southey, head of the second shelf Romantics, basically. There's the top shelf Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Keats and Byron and Coleridge, and then there's the second shelf. And Robert Southey is the best of the second shelf Romantic poets. Here's his instructional poem, The Old Man's Comforts and How He Gained Them. You are old, Father William, the young man cried. The few locks which are left you are grey. You are hale, Father William, a hearty old man. Now tell me the reason, I pray. In the days of my youth, Father William replied, I remembered that youth would fly fast, and abused not my health and my vigour at first, that I never might need them at last. You are old, Father William, the young man cried, and pleasures with youth pass away, and yet you lament not the days that are gone. Now tell me the reason, I pray. In the days of my youth, Father William replied, I remembered that youth could not last. I thought of the future, whatever I did, that I never might grieve for the past. You are old, Father William, the young man cried, and life must be hastening away. You are cheerful and love to converse upon death. Now tell me the reason, I pray. I am cheerful, young man, Father William replied. Let the cause thy attention engage. In the days of my youth I remembered my God, and he hath not forgotten my age. Okay, so this is Robert Southey's original poem, another wonderful 19th century didactic poem. Which, and you notice the trend, of course, you've got the three observations by the young man, and notice the young man is observing what appears to be a contradiction in the old man, right? Dude, you're old, right? You're old and you've got barely any hair and what you have is gray, but you're like all strong and hardy. Aren't you supposed to be like weak and frail? Like, what's the reason for this contradiction between your age and your haleness, your health? Why are you in such good health? And the reason, he gives an instructive lesson, right? Because I abused not my health and my vigor at first, that I never might need them at last, right? Because I took good care of myself when I was young and didn't fritter away my youth in like drinking and smoking and all kinds of other shameful behaviors, right? And so therefore I am hale and hearty in my old age. And then the young man says, well, again, another dilemma, right? On the one hand, like everybody knows that pleasures pass away with youth, and you're old, right? You're old and pleasures pass away with youth. Everybody knows that. But you like aren't grumpy about it, right? Like you don't sit around and complain like, oh man, my lost youth and everything sucks now. Like he seems to be all cheerful about it, being old. Why is that? And the answer, of course, is that when he was young, he remembered that youth could not last, right? So he didn't just invest himself in his youth. He thought of the future whenever he did. So he's been thinking of the future since he was young, and therefore doing some busy bee action like Isaac Watts's poem, right? Thinking of the future, whatever I did, that I never might grieve for the past. So like my whole life, I've been trying to make the most of my time and be industrious. I have nothing to lament, right? I've lived a wonderful, healthy, constructive, wholesome life, right? So I have nothing to regret. And I have like laid in a great, store of satisfaction for myself. So there we go. Now the third contradiction that he sees, right? Man, your life is hastening. You are old, right? You're like on the doorstep of death, right? You got one foot in the grave, old man. And yet you're cheerful and you're not like sensitive about it. Like you talk about death all the time. It doesn't seem to bother you, despite the fact that apparently like death has got to be ready to tap on your shoulder at any minute because you're so old, right? To which, and then this other conflict is resolved by Father William, who says, now pay close attention to this, young man, right? In the days of my youth, I remembered my God, and he hath not forgotten my age. Because he has had faith in God throughout his life, he has no fear for his future, and death holds no fears for him. So we have the religious moral at the end, the living a wholesome life moral in the other two sections, and there we go. So here's our constructive poem by Robert Southey, and I hope we've all been improved by that. Now, Alice is told to recite this, right? So the caterpillar challenges her. When she tells him about how she tried to recite How Doth the Little and it didn't come out right, he wants to test this theory, right? Will this hold true? So he asks her to recite another, and he requests this one, right? Recite You Are Old, Father William. So here she goes. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? In my youth, Father William replied to his son, I feared it might injure the brain, but now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why I do it again and again. You are old, said the youth, as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turn a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? In my youth, said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple. You are old, said the youth, and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it? In my youth, said his father, I took to the law, and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life. You are old, said the youth. One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever, yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever? I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough, said his father. Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. I almost got to the very end without breaking up laughing. I love this. This is one of the this poem is hilarious, right? If you don't find this poem hilarious, I don't know how to help you. But anyway, first of all, notice the joke in the last stanza. I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough, said his father. Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. What's the joke? What's the joke there? You see the joke? Yeah, the original poem only had 3 questions. The original poem is only 6 stanzas long, right? He asks him 3 questions, and he answers the 3 questions. So not only does he parody the questions and answers, right, from the 6 stanzas of the original poem, he then adds these other 2, right? He adds a 4th question. And the father flat refuses, like, it's too much. I answered 3 questions. That's like all I was contracted to do, right? The original poem only has 3 answers to it. So I refuse to answer the 4th. And it's almost like, it's almost like we get an outtake at the end, right? Like, or like if the very patient, cheerful and rather insufferable old man from Southey's poem, were to have been asked a 4th question, he would have snapped, right? Right. It's kind of the funny, the funny implication. I just love that. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. Oh man. And the pairing of give yourself airs with kick you downstairs, right? The reversal, right? You're puffing yourself up and I'm going to knock you down. I just, that if there could be anything, there could be no more violent departure from the old man's tone in the original poem, right, than the line, be off or I'll kick you downstairs. Right? Oh man, that's just hilarious. And do you think I could listen all day to such stuff? Right? Like, like, notice that it's like a meta joke about the tediousness of the other poem, right? Do you think I could listen all day to such stuff? Like, look, man, 6 stanzas of this didactic poem was enough, right? If you expect me to extend this didactic poem to 8 stanzas, you have another thing coming. Nobody could possibly put up with that much garbage, right, in one day. Be off or I'll kick you downstairs. Fantastic. And of course, the 4th question, is the most nonsensical one. You are old. One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever? Right? He does this quite impossible thing. And there's the 2 things are barely related to each other, right? Like, it's really unraveling strongly in that stanza. Yeah. Good. Anyway, look at the rest of the poem. I want to start with the end because it's my favorite part. The young man starts by identifying a similar contradiction. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white. And yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? Right? Okay. What's he done? Carol, I mean, what's the poet done in this stanza? Done to the original, right? You are old, Father William, the young man cried. The few locks which are left you are grey. You are hale, Father William, a hearty old man. Now tell me the reason, I pray. Now, by the way, someone was pointing out an excellent point before, and I don't want to skip it. Yes. Who is that? Sorry, sometimes the color that... It's JJ. Okay, sorry. I've got a navy blue background, and JJ, your Twitch is putting your name in dark blue letters, so I can like barely read it. Right. JJ says, Mears, the end of the first line seemed like it's switching rhythm or something. You were absolutely right about that. The few locks which are left you are grey. You are hale, Father William, a hearty old man. Now tell me the reason, I pray. Hear that rhythm? Whereas the first line is different, isn't it? You are old, Father William, the young man cried. You hear the difference, right? What stands out in that stanza? The young man, right? That's a spondaic. Both of those syllables are stressed. The young man. Imagine if there were a slightly more young man, right? And so you added a syllable like, you are old, Father William, the younger man cried. That would be perfect, right? The rhythm would be perfect, I mean. So there's a syllable missing. The young man cried. So it does give the end of that first line an almost like triplet feel, right? Like you're skipping a beat. You are old, Father William, the young man cried. The few locks which are left you are grey. I keep almost misreading that word because it's really awkward. I think you're supposed to read it, the few locks which are left you are grey. It's a very insistent rhythm in these lines, but it doesn't jive with it. That's just not a good line there. Nothing like Lewis Carroll's lines. And then we get every young man stanza, we get that same pattern, JJ, at the beginning, right? You are old, Father William, the young man cried. Yeah, good. So anyway, but back to the original, and we get that you are old, Father William, the young man said. He repeats that same exact pattern. And your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? The sound of the rhythm exactly identical to the original one, except better. And your hair has become very white is a very smooth and easy line to read. Anyway, okay. Yeah, so the difference, as JJ says, the questions that the young man asks in the first one are seeking wisdom, right? He's noticing a puzzling contradiction, right? Or rather, something contrary to his expectation, to the young man's expectations, right? Of what he expects to find in an old man. What is the reason for this apparent contradiction in you, wise old man, right? And here the young man is, as JJ says, chastising Father William. Your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? There is an intrinsic contradiction. The intrinsic contradiction is that you are a white-haired old man, and yet you're behaving like a young child. Yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right? Now, what we expect from the original text, and again, notice the brilliance of this. The whole premise of the original poem is there are expectations. Those expectations are disappointed, right? And so he's inquiring, why is it that this is not working out like I expect it to work out? I expect you to be weak, crotchety, and afraid to die. Because you're old, right? And isn't that what it means to get old? To be weak, crotchety, and afraid to die, right? How is it that you're neither weak, crotchety, nor afraid to die? So that's the premise. It's the I perceive something that is that differs from my expectations, right? And so I want to know the answer to it. And of course, this is an opening for him to be edified by the great wisdom of the old man. The shape, although it's turned very differently, exactly as you say, JJ. There's a rebuke implied Not a marveling, but a rebuke. So there's already an almost like a 90-degree turn, right, in the young man's attitude towards Father William, right? But again, the shape is still the same. Like, you are not I expected a little more gravitas in a man of your age, right? But you're standing on your head all the time. Do you think that's right? Right? Like, do you think that's how old men are supposed to act? So what should we get now? Again, based on the expectations that we've built from the original poem, which is about expectations and them being disappointed. We expect the old man to respond with, maybe like that was, again, it was a little, the young man's a little harsher, right, than the other one, but we could still recover this. We could still make a good didactic poem out of this, right? If he says something like, in my youth, I tried to be like totally serious, but as I grew older, I realized that you should sing tra-la-la more often and eat bannocks in the moonlight. Like, that could be like the direction that Father William could go, right, in order to still go in a Southey-ish direction. The kind of direction that the original poem builds us to expect to hear from the old man, right? Instead, in my youth, I feared it might injure the brain. But now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again. That's not the kind of wisdom we were expecting from him, right? Notice it still has the same shape, right? I had one belief when I was younger, but as I grew older and more mature and more wise, I realized a truth that had escaped me when I was young, right? When I was young, I thought I would injure my brain by standing on my head, so I didn't do it, right? But as I've grown older, I have learned that I definitely do not have a brain. And so therefore, there's no reason not to stand on my head now, is there? Right? Again, it's the superficial shape of Father William's reply, but quite different, quite unexpected, right? Turning on its head, as it were, this whole image of the sober, wise, benevolent old man of Southey's poem. It does stand the original poem on its head, Mighty Felix. That's exactly right. Now the second one, which I think is might be my favorite. It's so hard to choose favorites in this poem. You are old, said the youth, as I mentioned before. I love that. I notice how it's teasing the original poem, right? The young man keeps saying exactly the same thing. You are old, Father William, the young man cried. You are old, Father William, the young man cried. Like the first line of stanzas 1, 3, and 5 are exactly identical, right? And so Carroll draws attention to this in a comic way, which perfectly fits the rhyme, the metrical scheme. You are old, said the youth, as I mentioned before, right? I'm going to return to my original topic, which is that you are old, right? And have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? And these two things seem almost entirely disconnected, right? I mean, other than, I suppose, people who are uncommonly fat might find it difficult to turn a back somersault in at the door. I think I can relate to that. So I suppose there's that sort of disjunction there. But again, notice this is, you are old. Notice the thing that follow the you are old, as I mentioned before, right? You are old, the few locks which are left you are gray. You are old, and pleasures with youth pass away. You are old, and life must be hastening away, right? Notice, of course, that those all rhyme with each other, right? Notice also, to give Southey his credit, that the last rhyme, right, the last line of each of the young man's lines are also identical. Now tell me the reason I pray. And you notice the way that Southey twists the word pray. So that by the end, he keeps saying, pray, tell me the reason. And at the end, he's telling him to pray, right, to God, right? And that's a clever turn by Southey there at the end. Southey's poem isn't a bad poem. It's tedious in some ways and didactic, but not a terrible poem. But that you are old and have grown most uncommonly fat is almost a non sequitur, right? As is turning a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? We do get the pray inserted there, right? But notice the difference in stanzas 3 and 5 between what is the reason I pray and starting with pray. Pray, what is the reason of that? Pray, how did you manage to do it? Yeah, exactly. He takes pray and reason as well. Yep, exactly. But here he's asking the youth is wandering away from pointing out an apparent. The first one was still an apparent contradiction, right? A strange disappointment of expectation. You are an old white-haired man, and yet you're incessantly standing on your head. That's weird. What's up with that, right? He's not stating the same kind of contradiction. You are old and fat, and you turn to somersault. Why? Right? In my youth, said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple. This is the most scathing satire in the whole poem, isn't it? He begins by answering in exactly the same way that Southey's old man does. In my youth, I kept all my limbs very supple. So do you want to know how you can still be agile enough when you are old and fat to turn back somersaults in at the door? I'll tell you my secret, right? And that's not unlike the answer to the first question of the old man in Southey's poem, right? Good living in my youth, that's how, young man, right? And so if you follow my great example, then you too will have supple limbs when you get old, right? But then you notice where he turns it into an advertisement. By use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple, right? He becomes a charlatan offering a mountebank, right? Offering nostrums, right? Offering fake remedies. The juxtaposition of the wise counsel of Southey's old man, Southey's Father William, with this kind of like cheap advertisement for some exploitative product, right, is oh man, it's perfect. It is a perfect send up of this, to juxtapose this giving of wisdom with the selling of merchandise and the selling of questionable merchandise, right? Oh man, it's awesome. Yes, exactly. Jackrabbit Monster says, follow me for more limberness tips. Yeah, exactly. You could see a version of this poem that would have been written. I assume, Lewis Carroll might have included to create a similar effect, right? He might have said, he kept all his limbs very supple with one simple trick, right? Click here to learn more. That's exactly the kind of language, like the way that he is parodying the language of crank advertisements in the 19th century press is very much like that. I mean, you've exactly hit on the tone there, Jackrabbit Monster. That's exactly right. But again, the way that he's parodying this giving of advice, like again, the juxtaposition of the cheapening of the advice of the old man by, in parallel, comparing it to the selling of fake remedies, implying that the advice that the old man that Southey's old man is giving is just as useless and perhaps even as exploitative and self-serving in some way. Again, it's just delightful. "You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones in the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" That is my favorite rhyme in this entire poem. The rhyme of suet with do it. Oh man, so perfect, so hilarious. Like that is just, oh man, that is so Lewis Carroll. "In my youth, I took to the law and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life." He doesn't just continue getting more and more absurd, right? He kind of pivots it back and does a joke in a different direction. A joke at the expense of lawyers and wives both, right? "The muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life." And of course, that's very close, in a sense, closely parallel to the kind of advice that Father William was giving in Southey's poem. But twisted and absurd, not as absurd, of course, as finishing the goose with the bones in the beak. Oh man. Yes. Copperfinch says, "Gerontologists are begging their patients not to do this." Absolutely. Yep. All right. It's very late, but I couldn't not talk about the Father William poem today. Fortunately, there's more poems upcoming. Of course, I did not get all the way to chapter 6, but we got most of the way through chapter 5. Let's continue reading. Read 7 and 8 for next time. We'll see how we do. I'm not giving up yet. I'm mostly treading water, I think. Hopefully not salt water. It's not certainly a pool of my own tears yet to this point. But anyway, thank you for joining me. This has been a great deal of fun. I feel like some of the patterns are starting to gel a little bit, don't you think? Let's continue to see as we get to Pig and Pepper, which is we will get to the Mad Tea Party, which is one of the most famous moments in Alice in Wonderland. But first we have to get through Pig and Pepper, which is not one of the moments that's most famous in this book. So we will see. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. And I will see you guys again next week. Bye now.